All right, good afternoon. I'd like to get everyone's attention and call to order our last session, which is a keynote conversation between Jim McGann and Ambassador Rich Verma. Jim has graciously agreed to introduce Ambassador Verma. So I will introduce Jim and then just make one comment about Ambassador Verma that perhaps Jim's not as familiar with and certainly might not appear in his official bio. Jim McGann is the head of the Think Tanks and Civil Society program here at the University of Pennsylvania. The Think Tank and Civil Society program is affiliated with the Lauder Institute and also with Penn Global. I've known Jim for many, many years, and I'm amazed at the breadth and extent of his work, thinking about the role of think tanks as sources of information, drivers of innovation and knowledge, but also their influence and relationship to politics. Jim works all over the world running symposia, networking conferences, and gathering sessions for think tanks in different regions and countries. He is often in India and South Asia working with South Asian think tanks. I believe he met Ambassador Verma a few years ago at one of the South Asia, the India networking conferences through the Think Tanks and Civil Society program. I would say it's important to point out, many of you saw the phalanx of young people who came in with Jim. He's a little bit of a Pied Piper here on campus. He runs a large internship and mentoring program through the Think Tanks and Civil Society program. So I'm thrilled that he brought his interns here with him today to be part of this dialogue. I'd like to invite Jim and Ambassador Verma to join us on the stage. As I mentioned, Jim is going to introduce Ambassador Verma, but I think it's very important to point out, for the purposes of our gathering here today, that Ambassador Verma joined us on the panel of experts who reviewed the initial proposals for the India Research and Engagement Fund. So as much as anyone else, he is responsible for the great breadth of research work that you got to hear about today. So I want to publicly thank Ambassador Verma for contributing, volunteering his time and energy to helping with Penn's engagement in India, and invite Jim and Rich to the stage.
All right. This is intended, although the stage creates some impediments, as a conversation, which will start with some structured questions, which are in 4 segments. One is about the current state of foreign affairs and the State Department, given events of the last several weeks. The second is on U.S. India relations. The third segment is around this research symposium, and the fourth set of questions are, since there are so many young people in the audience, students who are interested in international and public affairs, addressing from the ambassador, who has had a long and distinguished career in public service, why you're passionate about international affairs and why public service is important. But before we launch into that, I wanted to, for those who are not already familiar with the ambassador's distinguished career, just a few highlights so we can get into the questions. Ambassador Richard Verma is currently vice chair and partner of the Asia Group, where he leads the firm's growth or expansion in South Asia. He previously served as the U.S. ambassador to India from 2014 to 2017, and it's when I first met the ambassador as a part of a all India think tank summit that the State Department supported to facilitate collaboration, and at which Richard spoke. A leading expert on trade and diplomacy in Asia, Ambassador Verma brings 25 years of experience across senior levels of business, law, diplomacy, and the military. Nominated as a U.S. ambassador to India by President Obama, and I must point out that an important and unusual facet is he was unanimously approved, and if you were following the current saga of ambassadors who are not even considered, and certainly very few these days who are unanimously approved. It is, even during the Obama years, a badge of distinction because it requires bipartisan support. Ambassador Verma oversaw one of the largest U.S. embassies with a variety of programs and launched a number of important initiatives to strengthen the bilateral relationship during his tenure. In addition to his role, and I'm abbreviating some of it in terms of his bio, he is, in addition to his role with the Asian group, Ambassador Verma is a senior fellow at the Georgetown Wells School of Foreign Service, Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and the ambassador also co-chairs the Center for American Progress, its U.S. India Task Force, which has charted an actionable bilateral agenda to deepen U.S.-India ties. And so this discussion is a nice segue to where the session at the end started. I think often there is what the U.S. can bring to India. I'm a big proponent in terms of the summits that we hold and organize in every region of the world, that we must meet as partners and that we have as much to learn as from our partners and countries that we work with as they have to learn from us. It's an exchange of peers and partners, not of one country dictating to another. So without further ado, let me start with some of the questions. Given the events involving Ukraine and Turkey over the last several weeks, I'm curious what you think are the implications for U.S. foreign policy, diplomacy, and the Foreign Service?
Wow, starting with
an easy question. I figured let's ease into the discussion.
In my prior job, I would have refused to answer this question. But first, let me thank you for the invitation to be here and be with all of you. 4:30 on a Friday. This is a pretty good turnout. I'm sure you're here for the Diwali portion of the event. But I've been following the success of the program and the annual event that you have, and I really think this is fabulous and much needed. So on to current events, and let me answer that question by just telling you a little bit about what it actually means to be an ambassador. And I was a political ambassador. I will tell you, I wrote a check for about $200 to President Obama, so I don't think it was the size of the check that got me to New Delhi. So in the Obama administration, we probably had 30% of the ambassadors were political ambassadors. And I know there's a debate going on right now whether we should even have political ambassadors. And I suspect that's more about, not necessarily having political ambassadors, but having large donors without qualifications serve as ambassador. But having said that, it's pretty daunting when you go out to post. You show up with one thing. You show up with a letter from the President of the United States. And you are to present that letter to the President of India, not the Prime Minister. You present your credentials to the President of India. And you do that so that the President of India and that the Indian government knows you have the full and unqualified support of your host government, that this is, in fact, the President's representative. And the jobs are not easy. They are, it's a great honor, but the agendas are difficult. And when I think about what has occurred not only over the last few weeks, but really over the last few years, because this builds on a bit of a trend line, which is, the kind of hollowing out or gutting of diplomacy generally. We had gotten to a point in our foreign policy, both Republicans and Democrats had supported a strong presence overseas, so supported diplomacy and development. And it was our military that was the strongest advocate for our foreign service. because they knew preventing conflicts, reducing the potential for conflict was a heck of a lot more cost-effective and important to lives than deploying troops everywhere. So we had gotten to a point where there was bipartisan agreement. When the administration came in and slashed the State Department by about 40%, that was jarring. And that was destabilizing, and it really gave our adversaries a bit of an upper hand. The second thing that has occurred is really this politicization of our foreign policy. And what I think I've been most concerned about over the last few weeks is the lack of support for those ambassadors that are out there needing the support and cover of the President and the Secretary of State. And this shadow foreign policy, or this kind of corruption of foreign policy for political purposes or financial purposes is devastating. It's devastating to the morale of the department. It's devastating to the career Foreign Service, but it's dangerous for our country. And so I think this is a moment of real, sadness, and two, real risk to the country. And unfortunately, I think we're just at the beginning of learning what has actually occurred. And so I actually find it to be incredibly serious.
Just a quick follow-up. Will we be able, in your estimation, to recover in terms of to get diplomacy back on track, whatever administration comes in?
Yeah, we'll definitely be able to recover. I've been actually pretty careful about not being too political over the last few years, because I really believe in a bipartisan foreign policy. And on our topic at hand, U.S. India relations, I really believe the gains have been, from Eisenhower to George W. Bush to President Obama and forward. So it's been very bipartisan over the years. But I don't think the current leadership in the State Department or the White House can turn this around.
All right. The second set of questions is around U.S. India.
I should be clear, the current political leadership.
Okay. In your opinion, what are some of the greatest regional and global challenges we face, and how can the U.S. and India tackle those challenges together?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because I could go through the range of regional and global challenges, from climate change to terrorism to income inequality to development needs. But what I think the challenge I would put to this group and to the University of Pennsylvania and to scholars studying U.S.-India relations is, do we really have that potential to solve global challenges?
Okay.
I hope the answer is yes. We've seen glimpses of it. The fact that we could come together in Paris for the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, and that was a classic case study of what was possible. And if you talk to President Obama, he would tell you there would be no Paris Climate Agreement but for the leadership role that India played and the hours that he spent talking to Prime Minister Modi about trying to reach a common place in terms of how to solve India's development needs while also addressing the climate challenges. But that coming together in a multilateral setting was rare.
Yeah.
And I think bilateral cooperation has made a lot of gains over the last 20 years, but we don't do anything militarily anywhere in the world. And there's a lot of reasons, historical reasons for that. We really don't operate together in multilateral institutions. And again, there are historical reasons for that. Our regional cooperation has been somewhat kind of ad hoc we're starting to do more in terms of military exercises and some regional dialogues, but we're just at the beginning. There are a load of problems we should tackle together. In fact, I am not meaning to suggest we can't do it. We haven't done it in the past, but when I look into Asia for the future, there is no more important relationship to the United States than India for exactly the kinds of problems we're going to face: security, climate, economic, migration, urbanization, health, innovation, all of these problems. If we really come together, and we don't have to be treaty allies to do this, if we really come together, then yeah, we can do a lot together. But those days are in front of us.
Yes. And in that context, how would you characterize the current U.S.-India relationship, and where are some of the areas where it needs to be moved forward or improved?
Yeah. So, again, without getting into too much of a history of the relationship, you know, this, as I think about the U.S.-India relationship, I think about the ambassador's residence in Delhi. And I think of all the photographs of all the U.S. presidents that are on the wall meeting Indian prime ministers. And you can almost tell from the photograph whether we're in a good period or whether we're in a bad period. Which is pretty much why we took down all the Nixon pictures, because those were, that was not a particularly good period. No, I didn't take those down, I'm sure. But from 1947, from India's independence forward, we've been on this...
And up and down.
Up and down, up and down. 59 to 64, really strong. Eisenhower and Kennedy, and not enough has been written about how much the second term of President Eisenhower and President Kennedy's short term in office, how strong that relationship was. In fact, when China invaded India in 1962, Prime Minister Nehru sent 2 urgent cables to President Kennedy asking for military assistance. President Kennedy delivered on that military assistance. Now, he did not send the fighter jets and the ground forces that the Prime Minister wanted, but that's how close we were. We supported India militarily in its conflict against China. Now, just fast forward 7 years later, or 9 years later, to President Nixon, and 1971, things had changed dramatically. We had actually doubled down on our security relationship with Pakistan. Why? Because Pakistan was helping us in our Cold War efforts against the then Soviet Union. Pakistan was helping us to reach out for a new relationship with China. And we supported Pakistan when, at that point in time, East Pakistan was fighting a war of liberation, which became Bangladesh. And so we really hardened our position against India in 1971, and that was rock bottom. I'm only going through this history because it's important to today. From 1971 to basically 1992, when President Clinton came into office, we advanced the ball almost nowhere down the field. Think about this statistic for a second. In 1985, the two-way trade number between the U.S. and China was $7 billion. In 1985, the two-way trade number between the U.S. and India was $5 billion, about the same. Fast forward to today. The U.S.-China trade numbers are approaching $800 billion. The U.S.-India two-way trade numbers are about $140 billion. We missed out on a whole period of cooperation. So there was essentially stagnation. President Clinton came into office and said, I want a new relationship with India. And what he ended up with were India nuclear tests, Pakistan nuclear tests, renewed conflict between India and Pakistan, sanctions against India, and we were back in that cycle again until the year 2000, when President Clinton, he did a couple things. He dehyphenated the relationship between India and Pakistan. He visited the country, said it's time for a new independent relationship, irrespective of what happens with Pakistan. That sets us on the modern course. So I mention that because, in my view, the U.S. India relationship is about 18 years old, not 72 years old, not 200 years old like we have with some of our closest friends and partners. It's less than 20 years old. So what happens in relationships that are less than 20 years old? Fragile, can't withstand a lot of shocks. But if you were a betting person in 2000 and you bet on this relationship, you'd have the Amazon of foreign policy relationships. This has been a dramatically rising stock until about 18 months ago.
Okay.
That's why I tell you that story. Now, what held us together over that 2000 to 2018? It was essentially a common shared vision, and that was a strong and prosperous India was good for India, but it was good for the United States too. Obviously, counterbalancing China's rise, supporting democracy, huge economy with big markets on both sides. And that vision held through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, and it held with Secretary Mattis, it held with the National Security Advisor, McMaster, and it held with Secretary Tillerson. Where are we today? Those three people are not present in the administration today. So that vision, that strategic vision, does not exist. And so what you have is you have an imbalance. You have the relationship now dominated by the U.S. Trade Representative. You now have a highly transactional relationship. And if you, again, think about our history, it's really a history of mutual distrust and estrangement and non-convergence. So if you're going to go back to this kind of highly transactional, what are you doing for me today, shared values and strategic vision don't mean as much, boy, you're getting into some choppy waters, and it tends to take us back. Now, I think we can get out of it, but it requires some strategic thinkers who can look down the road and see the promise of the future of the relationship. And I will say, the future, and all of you are here today because you believe, I think, in the India relationship, but just think about the India of 2030, a country that will lead the world in almost every category. Obviously, the most people, biggest middle class, third largest military, third largest economy, the most massive spending on infrastructure over the next 10 years, $4.5 trillion over the next 20 years. 2/3 of the India of 2030 is not yet built yet, have the largest number of college graduates. So I could go on and on. I mean, we should be excited about this relationship. We should be excited about where India is headed. But we don't really have a strategy or set of policies to match that kind of excitement. And to be fair, India probably doesn't have a set of policies to match a partnership with us, too. We're pretty complicated.
But we're glad to have people like you who are focused on that and helping make that happen.
Here at Penn today, yes, I am. Here today.
Well, beyond Penn. So shifting now to the research symposium today, today's India Research Symposium covered a range of topics, as you heard, in the fields of engineering and technology, economics, health, and the environment, among others. For the faculty focusing on these debates, what questions would you ask them, or what advice would you provide them?
Yeah, so good and big, important topics. And here's what I would say. I would say governments are inherently limited in what they can get done. And sometimes that when I was in that job, you know, in Delhi, I used to think the best thing I can do is get out of the way and let the researchers, the scientists, the innovators talk to each other, work with each other, and if we could facilitate in that in some way, that's terrific. But the range of challenges are massive, and we haven't quite figured out how to solve them, either individually or collectively. In the health space, you know, we should figure out a way to work together to eliminate tuberculosis and malaria in India. In the digital economy space, we need to figure out a way to work together to actually provide kind of incredible digital connectivity to our populations without risking privacy. And with the ability to share information back and forth, how do we do that? We don't quite know. The infrastructure challenges in India are pretty substantial, but I think the real potential of the relationship is not what we do bilaterally, it's what we can do in third countries and abroad. So can we work together in Africa? Can we work together in Afghanistan? Can we work together on global health problems, on climate and clean energy? This requires a different kind of partnership. It requires India that actually wants to take on that set of roles and wants to take it on with us. But there's no restrictions on leading researchers working with Indian researchers to try to solve problems in the public space. That's exactly what should be happening.
Knowing Penn, and I mean, you've addressed the sort of partnership dimension, what areas would you see as offering the greatest potential in terms of Penn and India in terms of, and what advice would you provide in shaping those?
Wow, those are good questions. I think, look, when I think about the big issues that are facing India, they are the big issues facing the United States.
Yeah.
How do you deliver healthcare at an affordable and accessible way? How do you decrease income inequality between the very top and the bottom of the economic pyramid? How do you combat, again, our challenges in the climate space and deliver clean energy to more people? How do you skill people for 21st century opportunities as opposed to 20th century opportunities? So these are big, common issues that we're wrestling with here, no different than within India as well. And we need people to be working on these solutions collectively.
And collaboratively. But
Absolutely.
all right, as you can see above and down here, the room is filled with students, and I'm curious as to your views on why you are passionate about international affairs and why students should pursue a career in public service as you have done.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot. Like, how did you end up in public service? Why were you so driven to do things in the public space and in the international space? I wish I had a really sophisticated answer, but I really think it has to do with what my parents were doing and how they grew up. My mother was the product of the partition of India, lived through a very difficult time, became a social worker, and was trained in and on Gandhi's ashram. My dad was, again, part of this independence movement in India, and in fact tells me a story about how his high school graduation was suspended by a year because he was supposed to graduate in 1947. And things were so tumultuous, the future of India was so uncertain, he graduated in 1948 instead. And then he was so passionate about Indian independence, and he became a campus leader, was imprisoned for several months, small detail he didn't tell us until later in life. But the more I learned about their life, and I learned a lot more about their life having the honor to go back to many of the places where they taught, where they grew up, you start to realize what makes you tick, and so I start to say to folks, you don't really know where you're going until you know where you're from. And I really got a chance to understand where I was from. Now, if I was to go to medical school tomorrow, my parents would be thrilled. So there is that kind of,
It's not too late.
failure. There is the Indian parent failure side,
Yes.
So the ambassador title was okay. It wasn't everything. But I think, look, when I think about the people that showed up from the United States and India that had a big impact, sure, it was government officials. Obviously, presidential visits. Obama was pretty popular there. But I also looked at the impact that people in the private sector had. Corporate executives had, civil society leaders had. And the reason I mention that is, yes, you can have a career in public service. You can take the Foreign Service exam. You can become a diplomat. I would fully support that. Your country would be grateful if you did that. But you can also have a pretty big impact in other ways. You may work for an NGO that works on clean water. You may work for a company that provides digital connectivity to places. I just think there's a lot of different pathways. I will say that at some point in your career, you will have to look back, whether you're in the private sector or public sector, and just ask yourself a basic question: did I make a difference? And that difference doesn't have to be at a summit, right? It doesn't have to be negotiating a treaty. That difference can be in your community. That difference can be in your neighborhood. I am reminded of two stories, two from really significant families in our history. One was Eleanor Roosevelt, who used to say that the real battle for social justice and equality takes place in the small spaces. The spaces so small that they can't be seen. They are the neighborhoods, the ball fields, the schoolyards, where people may need an extra hand or can't be heard or need to be supported. Her point was, you don't necessarily have to go around the world to help people. The second story I'm reminded of, and it's particularly appropriate here, is a point that President Eisenhower used to make. And this is a true story. President Eisenhower went to India in 1959, first U.S. president to go there. And he gave a speech to the U.S. Embassy on December 11th, 1959. And as he was looking out into the audience, he saw a group of young kids. And he said to the kids, he asked the kids, he said, how old are you guys? And they said, we're 9 years old. And he said, 9 years old. He said, well, let me do the math. He said, what do you think the world will be like when you're my age? He did the math, and you know what he said? 2019. What do you think the world will be like in 2019? And he goes on to say that if we continue on the pace we're on, the world will be a pretty sick place. That's an exact quote. But he then goes on to say, but if we teach these kids a little better than what we're doing, little Indian kids and little American kids, then the people will show us the way. And Eisenhower had this huge passion for the people of the people. And I mention that story because I think it really is ultimately the people of both countries that will show us the way.
Final question before we open it to questions. Professionally, and following on your last set of comments, in terms of your career, do you find most rewarding or what you're most proud of, and big or small, based on what you just said. And then the final question is, if you were to give one bit of advice in terms of those who want to pursue a career in terms of diplomacy, what would that advice be?
Yeah. What am I most proud of? Gosh. You know, I guess I would say I took some risks when people were telling me I shouldn't do what I was about to do. So not only did I not become a doctor, I started my career in the military, right? And so for an immigrant kid to be in the U.S. Air Force was, at that point in time, pretty unusual. And the military has this great kind of equalizing way about it. You know, they yell at everybody equally, and you grow and rise equally. I worked on Capitol Hill when, gosh, I can count on one hand the number of staffers from Asia, let alone South Asia. Now we have 5 Indian American members of Congress, 5.5 if you count Senator Harris, right? So we've really come a long way, and I don't give myself some huge credit like, oh, you know, you went out and did this stuff. I was really lucky, had some really good bosses who gave me a chance, including, you know, some prominent people like Hillary Clinton, who gave me a chance, and Barack Obama, who gave me a chance, and you know, they were really good bosses.
Okay.
Now, for folks who are thinking about a career in diplomacy or public service, I think, you know, the fact that, again, that you're here on Friday afternoon suggests you are curious and passionate about a topic, unless you are forced to be here for credit. Sorry about that.
No, they weren't.
Okay. But you know, look, think about how competitive this world is and how important it is for you not just to learn about what's happening today, having a good appreciation for history. I tell people all the time, if you go into a diplomatic negotiation or a contact with a foreign government, thinking that literally history started when you arrived in that country or in that room, and some people have that view, then you're probably not going to be successful. So having a good sense of history, all those people who came before you on both sides, and a reminder that, you know, again, as President Obama used to tell us, use whatever metaphor you'd like, but we are tending to our part of the stream.
Right.
And it's a really long stream. And once we tend to it, we will go off, and other people will have to come. And we hope that we make advancements along the way and that we don't go backwards. And so having some modest expectations, staying true to yourself, follow your passion. I think especially in this environment, in this generation, with social media, with the need for social affirmation, I think we forget about what it is we actually want to do. And we let a lot of other people tell us what we should do, or we think society expects us to do something. It's really hard to break away from that. I know I now sound like your high school guidance counselor, but I'm not going to quote from what color your parachute is. But you do have to find that intersection of what you really love to do, what you're good at. Those don't often overlap the way they should.
Sure.
And then on behalf of your parents, I'll say, and where there might be an economic opportunity to actually, make a living and fend for yourself in the world. And I think, finding that intersection sometimes takes people their lives
to do. Yeah.
Other people know at the outset exactly what they want to do, and they find it.
Okay, wonderful. We're now going to open for questions. Priority is given as a custom to students. And you should not be afraid in the balcony and down here to ask questions. And so there is a mic, so if you raise your hand and you, or two mics.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, sir. I'm from India. I'm a student here at School of Engineering and Applied Science. So my question would be, you said that whenever there was an opportunity, you said you just stood out of the way and allowed the researchers between two countries to collaborate in your talk. And in this journey, what are the key hurdles that you have observed that stopped a full throttle collaboration between two research communities in India and US? What are the key hurdles that you've observed here?
Between the governments or the research
No,
community?
the research communities between two countries.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I actually think there are, I don't think there are that many hurdles between the research communities. I mean, there are some regulatory restrictions in India. You can't have a US university there. I know there were some problems with students getting college credit if they came here to the US to study. We need a lot more Indian students in the United States. We need a lot more US students to go to India. And there were some regulatory issues. But in terms of working together, studying together, gosh, I don't see the obstacles. And in fact, I see incredible enthusiasm on both sides. And you know, we do have this kind of natural affinity. The two countries really do. We shouldn't underestimate that. You know, we obviously have that with other countries, but we have it with India. There is a shared set of values. One of those values is a commitment to education and learning and this innovation ecosystem. We don't have that with every country and with every region. And so I actually think there's a huge amount of opportunity. Now, if you ask me about the governments, I think there's plenty of obstacles, plenty of third countries that are going to get in the way. There's all sorts of issues we can talk about. But on the research side, I think we're at the beginning, and I'd really love to see this thing grow exponentially.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, question here and a question here, and a question there. So 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Ambassador Verma, for your time. I'm an MBA student at Wharton, and I would like to get your thoughts on the Iranian oil sanctions that were recently imposed on India, preventing the country from purchasing Iranian oil. And in your historical context, you spoke a bit about the historical mistrust. So do you think imposing that sanction and not granting India the waiver that it requested for, given that it's a big importer, do you think that's going to open up the historical wound of mistrust, cause the policymakers in India to pursue more strategic autonomy and look at the United States as like not as much of a reliable partner?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I worked a lot on the original set of sanctions against Iran, not going back decades, but the modern sanctions, which penalize third countries if they bought oil from Iran. And what you had to show each year in order to avoid those sanctions was substantial reductions in your purchases. India was a really strong partner over at least a 5-6 year period of decreasing purchases to its detriment. Now, it needed Iranian oil. It had a strong relationship with Iran, but it shared generally the multilateral commitment to try to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons technology and nuclear weapons device. So they were part of the solution. We appreciated the reductions that they would make. Now, what happened probably about 6 months ago now is that the Indian government was informed literally kind of overnight without notice that not only substantial reductions would not be sufficient anymore, they had to go to zero, and they had to go to zero very quickly. That's not a great way to treat a friend and partner. It's not a great way to really see the kind of world through their lens. And if anything, it isolated us the United States even more because they wanted to be part of that solution that kept Iran kind of nuclear weapons free. Now, we've now put India in a challenging position, and our solution was, but you can buy shale gas and natural gas from us. You know, that didn't look all that attractive either as a great alternative. So I think it was a damaging way to handle things, but I could go back even further. I think it was exceptionally damaging to pull out of the Iran agreement to begin with from our side, which is why we had to go back to this notion of third-party sanctions against countries like India. So yes, I think it was a significant and serious mistake.
Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador, for coming out today. My name's Eric. I'm a sophomore. So you mentioned that India is going to be the top leader in a lot of things. You mentioned that India is going to have the largest population in the world. That also means India will be the world's largest democracy, which it already is right now. And so adding on to that, we historically know that China and India have had their ups and downs, but in our current stage, there's a need for more collaboration and cooperation between the two strong nations in Asia. How do you see India shaping democracy in Asia? Obviously, there's a lot of protests in Hong Kong, as we all know. Where do you see India's role in promoting democracy within Southeast Asia, and the whole world?
Yeah, great question. I mean, look, I think part of the reason this relationship is so important to the United States is because India is a democracy. Now, when they were writing their constitution, their constitutional drafters came here to the United States, took the elements that they thought were good from our Constitution and then adapted it, obviously, for their own purposes. But they are a federal system, a bicameral system, civilian control over the military, strong judiciary. We have a lot in common, and their democracy is not perfect, and ours is far from perfect. We're both trying to kind of get better at it. Now, you mentioned China. I thought you were going to ask more of a China question as opposed to an India democracy question. But the question about China is really important because, again, thinking about history, the country that most impacted the U.S. India relationship in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. And it just put us on different sides. There were Cold War alignments that had consequences. The country that will impact the U.S.-India relationship the most in this century is China. And it is drawn out of perhaps shared concern about China and hopefully trying to find that formula of working with China that doesn't lead to a confrontation. When I think about India-China relations, they remind me, frankly, a lot of U.S.-China relations. We have complicated economic relationship. We're entangled in so many different ways. We really don't seek a confrontation with China, and we talk a lot. The great thing about the India-China relationship, in fact, there was just a summit with the leader of China and the leader of India just 2 weeks ago. They talk at all levels, and that's a really positive way to disincentivize conflict. It doesn't mean that conflict is not possible. It just means that there are a lot of deterrents to India and China having a conflict with each other. But to answer your question directly about the impact that India can have on democracy across Asia, boy, I hope they have a big impact. And because if you think about what's happening in some of the ASEAN countries, for example, this tension between democratic forces and semi-authoritarian forces, these are not small stakes. And there are plenty of countervailing forces arguing for a more centralized, state-controlled, ultimately authoritarian model where human rights and basic freedoms are secondary in nature. India's influence, and look, the United States is only going to have limited influence in this part of the world. India's influence is going to be huge. They can say to other countries and demonstrate to other countries that there is an Asian model of democracy that works, that lifts people up. And so I hope they will choose to take on that role. Final thing I would say is they haven't taken on that role thus far. I think because of principles of not only non-alignment but non-intervention, I think their view has been to every country has to decide its own pathway. I think from a U.S. perspective, we would hope that India takes a more active role in the region to lift those countries to a more democratic path.
Two quick questions, if we can take them in succession, because Ambassador has to catch a train. I want to make sure that we get them in and he has time to answer. Quickly and succinctly, if possible.
Okay. Hi. Sorry. My name is William. I'm a TTCSP intern from Rutgers University. So in the light of the current administration, we saw a retreat from internationalism and multilateralistic efforts from the Paris Climate Accords and the United Nations Human Rights Council. So my question is, how would a representative of the United States still compel that vision of unity and convince the governments to work with the U.S. With recent events in Syria and as such?
Yeah.
If you want to take that one, because
Yeah,
it's a big one.
Let me take that one because it's a big one. I'll just say it again. I think with the current administration, it's tough to make that case. But I think countries realize that there is a long arc to foreign affairs and to foreign policy, and that the United States is the world's largest economy, is the most important player in the international system if we choose to be. My sense is the president thinks this is politically popular and this is what his constituents have demanded, which is essentially American retrenchment, kind of cozying up to the authoritarians, ceding space. But I think we're also witnessing what happens when America is not involved. You have essentially a world without guardrails. And you see the Middle East in turmoil. You see a lot of innocents being killed. You see the reemergence and strength of Russia and Turkey, frankly, and China. I think the trade situation with China has been drawn out, and frankly, it's quite small when we think about the challenges we face with China. It does nothing to address Chinese economic power or innovation or the role that they'll play. And in fact, we've not been focusing on those things here at home. So this is a particularly dark period for American foreign policy and American international engagement. I have great faith in the career professionals and the civil servants, and we've seen that over the last few weeks. They'll get us through this period.
Okay, last question.
All right, thank you for coming out here, Ambassador. All right, I'm a Moog, and I am a student at the Wharton School. And so you talked about how right now our relationship is very transactional, and how like the India of 2030 will be like the third largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering how we can ensure that in the future our relationship won't be more transactional than it is right now.
Yeah, great question. So, Prime Minister Vajpayee, who was the Prime Minister back in the 90s, I think, correct me if I got that wrong, he uttered a phrase which was really important at the time. He said, the U.S. and India are natural allies. We're natural allies. We are never, I don't want to say never, but in our lifetimes, we are not going to be treaty allies. I don't think we want a treaty with India. I don't think India wants a treaty with us. So the question is, for all of you really, and I think a good question for the researchers, is how do you build and become natural allies without the alliance? So how do you do that? I think you do that through a common vision about kind of where you want to go together. I think you do that through personal, trusted relationships. Go back through history. Eisenhower and Kennedy with Nehru, Galbraith with Nehru, Bush with Singh, Obama with Prime Minister Modi. I think you do it through personal relationships. I think you do it through trading relationships. We don't have even a bilateral investment treaty with India, let alone a free trade agreement. We need some structural agreement between us. You do it through all these people-to-people relationships. You do it through building the habits of cooperation. Remember what I said? This is an 18-year-old relationship. We don't have decades of experience of working with each other. And when you don't work with someone for a long time, you don't have a lot of trust built up. And on top of it, if you have a history that involves, the early 70s, for example, that trust kind of reservoir is pretty low. So you got to build that up. I'm naming a bunch of things that hopefully create a certain stickiness and agility that form a modern U.S.-India relationship so that we really can be natural allies, not just in word, but in practice. And if we are, then we can actually go about solving those challenges that are in the world today collectively without an alliance, without threatening other countries, but actually working for democracy, for we won't call it the post-World War II order anymore. We'll call it the 21st century order, which is multipolar, which has rising powers like India playing a leading role. But ultimately, you guys are going to have to figure that out, and I think you will.
Well, I want to thank you for coming out on a Friday afternoon and also for demonstrating why you are such an accomplished diplomat and your ability to be both warm, informative, and really connect with this group. And certainly in terms of the interns and students are here to inspire the next generation of policymakers and diplomats. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Amy has something.
So I first met Ambassador Verma about